Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Cut Rate Commander, the series in which we take a look at low-priced commanders and make budget decks with them. My name is Grazzet, and today we'll be looking at the Mad Prophet Eruth. Before we continue, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you like this content and would like me to continue making more videos like this in the future. And if you're feeling particularly generous, consider buying me a coffee at the link in the description to keep me caffeinated while I work on more of these builds. Also, be sure to stick around until the end of the video to see who won last week's poll and what commanders from Crimson Vow you'll be voting for an upcoming episode. So with that out of the way, let's start by taking a look at the commander and playstyle. Eruth Tormented Prophet is a 2/4 human wizard that costs 1, a blue and a red with the following ability. If you would draw a card, exile the top 2 cards of your library instead. You may play those cards this turn. As we can see, Eruth is sporting a low CMC, a defensive stat block for the cost, and a unique ability to convert all our normal draw into better impulse draw so long as she remains on the field. Breaking it down further, Eruth's ability converts all our normal draw into impulse draw too, effectively doubling all our card draw effects but only giving us a small window to use said cards, making it quite a simple ability on paper but in practice being much more complex. While of course getting the initial card advantage she provides is great in the short term, unless we manage those cards properly, we may find those resources going to waste while our hands diminish away to nothing. So while it's undoubtedly a powerful ability, we'll need to maximize our build to take advantage of its benefits while mitigating its downsides as best we can. In an effort to do that, this build will be a low-to-the-ground Spell-Slinger build with an emphasis on using spells that have built-in draw. That means we'll be running cards like Cantrips, who are relatively cheap and alongside our commander will actually generate us card advantage instead of just replacing themselves, as well as draw and discard effects, which are able to draw us upwards of 4+ cards and, since our hands are usually empty thanks to Eruth's ability, will usually have no impact on them. And since we'll be blazing through our deck at a breakneck pace as we cast these spells, we'll be running plenty of Spell-Slinger payoffs to turn all those spells into value. Whether that be damage or burn that we can throw at our opponent's creatures and faces, or more beneficial effects like card draw and mana generation to keep our turns going for longer. And with both parts of our deck working in conjunction, we'll be fully capable of storming off, a single turn allowing us to cast 5, 10, or even 15+ spells, each of which will proc our payoffs to get us more and more value and deal more and more damage, which will often be enough to win the game on the spot. And that's not just my word, but the very visions of Eruth herself. She may be a raving lunatic, but no prophecy she has ever foretold has ever failed to come to pass. And as for our opponents, she has foreseen them be reduced to cinders under the onslaught of magic we have at our disposal. And unlike herself, they'll never see it coming. So now that we know a bit more about the commander and playstyle, let's start looking at the deck itself by starting with the creatures. Skipping straight to the CMC2 slot, we have some damage-based spell-slinging payoffs with Electrostatic Field, Thermo Alchemist, Firebrand Archer, and Kessig Flamebreather, all of which are able to burn all our opponents simultaneously as we cast our spells. The first being a 0/1 defender that deals 1 damage to them whenever we cast an instant or sorcery. The second being a 0/3 defender that's able to tap itself to deal 1 damage to them, then untapping itself whenever we cast an instant or sorcery. And the final 2 being a 2/1 and 1/3 respectively that deal 1 damage to our opponents whenever we cast a non-creature spell. All 4 giving us some very solid AoE burn as we sling our spells, with the latter 2 even proccing off our artifacts, enchantments, and planeswalkers for even more potential damage. Smoldering Egg also joins us as another damage-dealing payoff, being a 0/4 defender that, whenever we cast an instant or sorcery, gains Ember counters equal to that spell's CMC, transforming into Ashmouth Dragon when it accumulates 7 or more, a 4/4 flyer that, whenever we cast an instant or sorcery, deals 2 damage to any target, taking a bit longer to come online than the previous entrance, but giving us a big evasive body to compensate when it does, as well as a free shock whenever we cast a spell that not only hits face but also troublesome creatures and walkers when necessary. Then we close out this slot with some ramp sources in the form of Runaway Steamkin and Goblin Electromancer. Runaway Steamkin is a 1/1 that gains a +1/+1 counter whenever we cast a red spell, capping at 3. That lets us remove 3 +1/+1 counters on it to generate 3 red mana, hitting the board early and serving as a superb way to extend our spell chains by generating us additional mana as we play our red spells. Goblin Electromancer is a 2/2 that reduces the cost of all our instants and sorceries by 1. The discount it provides being very handy to reduce most of the cost of our CMC2 spells to only a single mana, making them significantly easier to combo with mana generators like Runaway Steamkin to keep our spells flowing. The CMC3 slot then starts us off with Gutter Snipe and Electrode, both of which serve as additional sources of damage as we cast our spells, the former being a 2/2 that deals 2 damage to each opponent whenever we cast an instant or sorcery, making it the scaled up version of Electrostatic Field to deal even more AoE burn, and the latter being a 0/1 that we can tap to deal 1 damage to any target that untaps whenever we cast an instant or sorcery, being somewhat similar to Thermo Alchemist but dealing precise damage for more spot removal instead of AoE burn, both providing us with additional ways to turn our spell slinging into damage. Then we close out this slot with Burgi God of Storytelling, an MDFC whose front face is a 3/3 that, whenever we cast a spell, generates a red mana that's not lost until the end of the turn, in addition to letting our creatures boast twice. While her back face, Harnfell Horn of Bounty, is an artifact that costs 4 and a red that lets us discard a card to impulse draw 2, which we'll be running exclusively for her front face to serve as another spell-slinging mana generator to keep fueling our spells so long as we keep casting them. Finally, reaching the CMC4 slot, we have our last trio of creatures with Archmage Emeritus, Stormkiln Artist, and Lamholt Raconteur. Archmage Emeritus is a 2/2 that, whenever we cast or copy an instant or sorcery, draws us a card, allowing us to dig deeper into our deck as we cast our spells for even more spells to cast, making it a great source of mana-less card advantage. Stormkiln Artist is another 2/2 that gains +1/+0 for each artifact we control, and, whenever we cast or copy an instant or sorcery, creates a treasure, making it perhaps the most potent of our mana generators thanks to the treasures it creates being able to produce both our colors, often extending our combos to the point that our opponents will either have to remove them or lose on the spot. Lamholt Raconteur is a 2/4 with Daybound that, whenever we cast a non-creature spell, deals 1 damage to each opponent, and when it's night, transforms into Lamholt Ravager, a 4/4 that deals 2 damage instead, making it the most expensive source of AoE burn we're running, but its stats and occasional transformation into another Gutter Snipe still make it worth it. That covers all our creatures, so let's move on to our instants. The CMC1 slot starts us off with a series of cantrips, the first half consisting of Opt, Thought Scour, and Expedite, each of which draw us a card and have an additional effect, the first allowing us to scry 1 before the draw, the second milling a player for 2, and the last giving target creature haste, all of which are mainly here to serve as very cheap spells that replace themselves or alongside our commander generate us card advantage, but whose abilities are still generally useful for the card selection, top deck disruption, and immediate tapping they provide. Our second wave of cantrips then brings us Obsessive Search, Whispers of the Muse, and Reach Through the Mists, again each drawing us a card, the first having a madness cost of a blue, the second having buyback for 5, and the last having no additional effect. This set having marginally less useful abilities but still fulfilling the deck's need for cheap spell-based draw, which is why we're running them. Then we end the slot with Brainstorm, which has us draw 3, then put 2 cards from our hand on top of our deck, impulse drawing us an impressive 6 cards with only a single mana and often not even affecting our hand since they're usually empty, making it quite possibly the best card advantage source we have for the cost. Moving on to the CMC2 slot, we have another pair of cantrips, those being Radical Idea and Think Twice. Again, each drawing us a card, but also being castable from our grave, the former through Jumpstart by discarding a card, and the latter via its flashback cost of 2 and a blue, initially serving as additional draw, but crucially allowing us to get more draw from our grave if we fail to draw into it, giving us an extra bit of reach to keep our spell chains going where they otherwise would have stalled. Then as we move deeper into this slot, we have some discard focus draw with Dangerous Wager, Desperate Ravings, and Is It Charm. Dangerous Wager has us discard our hand, then draw 2 cards, taking advantage of our usually empty hands to impulse draw us 4 alongside our commander for no drawback for some very solid card advantage. Desperate Ravings draws us 2 cards, then makes us discard a card at random, as well as having flashback for 2 and a blue, making it another draw 4 with effectively no downside, while also giving us more draw from the grave for even greater benefit. Is It Charm has us choose one of the following effects: counter target non-creature spell unless its owner pays 2, deal 2 damage to target creature, or draw 2 and discard 2, its suite of abilities making it a useful removal option when needed and a cheap source of draw when it's not. A pair of rituals then join us with Desperate Ritual and Pyretic Ritual, both of which generate 3 red mana, the former also having Splice to Arcane for 1 and a red, making them superb spells to draw into in spell chains that effectively cast for free and give us some extra mana to continue fueling our spells. Then we close out this slot with Starstorm, an X spell that deals X damage to each creature and we can cycle for 3, serving as a decent scalable board wipe if needed, while also giving us the option to cantrip it away for more draw instead for some solid flexibility. Finally reaching the CMC3 slot and our last few instants, we have a pair of draw and discard entrants with Frantic Search and You Find the Villain's Lair. Frantic Search has us draw 2, discard 2, then untap up to 3 lands, making it not only an additional source of card advantage for us with very little downside, but also paying for itself by untapping the lands we use to cast it, making it a near-perfect spell to draw into to extend our spell-slinging chains. You Find the Villain's Lair has us choose one of the following: counter target spell, or draw 2, then discard 2, its main advantage being the flexibility it gives us as a source of spell disruption when needed, or additional card advantage when it's not, which is enough to earn it a spot in this build. Then we have another ritual joining our ranks with Seething Song, which generates 5 red mana, making it our biggest instant speed ritual and, like its smaller cousins, serving as another spell that actually nets us mana when cast to keep fueling our spell slinging. Finally, our last instant is Chaos Warp, which has the owner of target permanent shuffle it back into their deck, then reveal a top card from it, allowing them to put it into play if it's a permanent. It's incredible non-destruction based removal, making it an incredible addition to help us deal with any threats our opponents may have in play. That covers all our instants, so let's move on to our sorceries. The CMC1 slot begins with another wave of cantrips, starting with some red entrants in the form of Ancestral Anger, Crash Through, Renegade Tactics, and Warlord's Fury, each of which draw us a card and, going down the line, either give target creature we control +1/+0 and trample until end of turn, gives all creatures we control trample until end of turn, prevents target creature from blocking until end of turn, or gives all creatures we control first strike until end of turn. The suite of offensive buffs it gives our board being somewhat lost due to our small creatures, but will allow us to get some damage in for a little bit more reach and, more importantly, are still all dirt cheap spells to keep proccing our payoffs. Then some blue cantrips join us with Preordain, Serum Visions, and Slip Through Space, again each of which draw us a card, the first allowing us to scry 2 before the draw, while the second scries 2 after the draw, and the last making target creature unblockable until end of turn, serving as even more cheap card advantage and giving us some card selection or free damage as a bonus, which we'll gladly take. Moving away from cantrips, we have some more draw and discard entrants with Burning Inquiry, Careful Study, and Faithless Looting. Burning Inquiry has each player draw 3 cards, then discard 3 cards at random, making it an incredibly cheap draw source that usually doesn't affect our hands, while completely disrupting our opponents. Careful Study and Faithless Looting both have us draw 2, then discard 2, with the latter also having Flashback for 2 and a red, making them both dirt cheap draw effects for our build, and, in the latter's case, also giving us additional draw from the grave. Breakthrough then joins us as another draw source, being an X spell that draws us 4 cards, and then has us choose X cards to keep in our hand, making us discard the rest, making it the most potent draw source for us at the cost, drawing us an impressive 8 cards alongside our commander for only a single mana, and even allowing us to scale it up if we happen to have cards in hand we'd rather keep. Moving away from draw, we have some mana generation joining us with Rite of Flame and Strike It Rich. Rite of Flame generates 2 red mana, making it the cheapest ritual we have, but still serving its purpose of giving us surplus mana as we cast it and proccing our payoffs, which is exactly what this build needs. Strike It Rich creates a treasure token and has flashback for 2 and a red, effectively making it free the first time we cast it and being another spell that we can cast from our grave to proc our payoffs while giving us a small mana bump for later. Then we close out this slot with Vandal Blast, which destroys target artifact we don't control and has Overload for 4 and a red, its base form being perfectly serviceable as a low mana spell to proc our Spell-Slinging payoffs, while its overloaded form is a great board wipe to level our opponent's artifacts while leaving ours unscathed. Our last set of cantrips then join us as we enter the CMC2 slot, those being Cleansing Wildfire and Scour All Possibilities, each drawing us a card, the former destroying a land and having its controller replace it with a basic from their deck, while the latter scries 2 before the draw and has flashback for 4 and a blue, both providing us with the card advantage we've grown accustomed to at this point, and giving us some additional utility with the land destruction and card selection they provide respectively. Then more draw and discard effects are up next with Goblin Lore, Ideas Unbound, and See Beyond. Goblin Lore draws us 4 cards, then has us discard 3 cards at random, making it a slightly more expensive version of Burning Inquiry that only affects us, but still being a superb draw effect by drawing us 8 on its own with almost no downside, so we'll happily run it. Ideas Unbound draws us 3 cards, then has us discard 3 cards at the end of the turn, getting us less cards initially than Goblin Lore, but giving us the opportunity to cast any spells we may have in hand before being forced to discard them, which may not always come up, but is still a good option to have. See Beyond draws us 2 cards, then has us shuffle a card from our hand back into our deck, giving us another bread and butter draw source with little downside to add even more card advantage to this build. Finally, we close out this slot with Grape Shot, which deals 1 damage to any target and has Storm, taking full advantage of our massive Storm potential by dealing an absurd amount of damage to a single or multiple opponents out of nowhere, making it a great finisher to end a chain of spells on. Then, skipping all the way to the CMC5 slot, we have our last sorcery with Mana Geyser, which generates a red mana for each tapped land our opponents control, potentially making it our most potent of ritual spells, easily generating us 10+ mana on its own to channel into our spellcasting, even if our opponents aren't fully tapped out. That covers all our sorceries, so let's move on to our enchantments. Jumping straight into the CMC2 slot, we have our only pair of enchantments with Firemind's Research and Sorcerer class. Firemind's Research gains a charge counter whenever we cast an instant or sorcery, and either lets us pay 1 a blue and remove 2 of those counters to draw a card, or pay 1 a red and remove 5 counters to deal 5 damage to any target, both providing us with a cheap source of repeatable card advantage to start or continue digging through our deck for more spells, as well as a cheap source of damage to help us close out games, both modes coming online very quickly thanks to the amount of instants and sorceries we'll be tossing around. Sorcerer class is a class enchantment that at level 1 has us draw 2 then discard 2. At level 2, which costs a blue and a red, lets all our creatures tap for either our colors but only lets us spend that mana on instants and sorceries. And at level 3, which costs 3, a blue and a red, deals damage to each opponent equal to the number of instants and sorceries we cast that turn, making it quite the stacked enchantment to generate us card advantage, provide fuel for our spells by turning all our creatures into mana dorks, and finally capping off by turning into a storm payoff that can easily win us the game on its own once we go off, all of which is perfect for this build. That covers all our enchantments, so let's move on to our artifacts. The CMC1 slot starts us off with Soul Ring, which taps for 2 colorless. Not being quite as good here as in other builds since we'd rather have the colored mana, but still being incredibly useful to get some of our more mana-hungry payoffs on board, especially in the early game, which is why we run it. We're also running Springleaf Drum in this slot, which we can tap and tap a creature we control to generate a mana of any color, making it a very cheap source of colored mana with no real downside for us as our creatures are rarely going to be swinging in. Moving on to the CMC2 slot, we have mana rocks all the way down, starting with Arcane Signet, which taps for any color in our commander's color identity, Izzet Signet, which we can pay 1 and tap to generate both our colors, Talisman of Creativity, which taps for a colorless or either our colors instead if we take a damage, and Prismatic Lens, which taps for a colorless and we can pay 1 and tap it to filter a mana, all of which speed up our mana curve and generate colored mana to help us pay for our low-cost spells more efficiently. Moving on to the CMC3 slot, we have our second to last artifact with Geist Flame Reservoir, which gains a charge counter whenever we cast an instant or sorcery, and either lets us pay 1, a red, tap it, and remove any number of charge counters from it to deal that much damage to any target, or pay 1, a red, and tap it to exile a top card from our deck and allow us to play it until the end of the turn. Its first ability being somewhat similar to Grape Shot, except we can store the charges across turns for a bigger burst of damage, while its second ability gives us some decent card advantage that, while it doesn't benefit from our commander's ability, does give us an extra bit of cheap card advantage to help keep a spell chain going. Finally, the CMC4 slot brings us our final artifact with Sentinel Tower, which, whenever we cast an instance or sorcery during our turn, deals damage to any target equal to 1 plus the number of instants or sorceries we cast before it that turn. Its damage starting off small, but quickly getting out of control as we play spell after spell, being able to quickly burn out our opponents or deal with troublesome creatures or planeswalkers we may have to get through first. That covers all our artifacts, so let's move on to our planeswalkers. Our only planeswalker joins us in the CMC4 slot, that being Ral Storm Conduit, who comes into play with 4 loyalty and has the following abilities. His passive deals 1 damage to target opponent or planeswalker whenever we cast an instant or sorcery, his +2 lets us scry 1, and his -2 copies the next instant or sorcery we would cast. His passive giving us another consistent form of burn and occasional planeswalker removal as we cast our spells, while his scry makes it a bit easier for us to ensure we draw into more cheap draw effects, and his ability to copy our spells allow us to double up on our best draw or rituals for a potent boost either way. That covers our planeswalker, so let's move on to our land base. Starting with our mana lands, we have Command Tower, which taps for any color in our commander's color identity, Shivan Reef, which taps for a colorless or either of our colors if we take a damage, Sulphur Falls, which comes into play tapped unless we control an island or mountain and taps for either of our colors, and Frostboil Snarl, which comes into play tapped unless we reveal an island or mountain and taps for both our colors. Moving on to our utility lands, we'll start off with Forgotten Cave and Lonely Sandbar, both of which come into play tapped, tap for a red or blue respectively, and have cycling for 1 mana of the color they would produce, each being serviceable land drops in the early game, but more importantly, allowing us to cantrip them away if we draw into them for only a single mana, enabling us to turn what would otherwise be a dead draw into actual card advantage during a spell chain. Then we close out our utility lands with Desolated Lighthouse and Gyre Reach Sanitarium, both of which tap for a colorless and let us draw and discard cards, the former letting us pay 1, a red, a blue, and tap it to draw 1 and discard 1, while the latter lets us pay 2 and tap it to have all players draw 1 and discard 1, each giving us effectively draw 2 from the land slot to keep digging deeper into our deck if we stall out during a spell chain, hopefully allowing us to draw into more spells. Finally, we're running 13 islands and 14 mountains as our basics to close out our land base. So now that we've covered all the cards in the deck, let's take a look at this deck's breakdown. This deck currently has 14 creatures including the commander, 19 instants, 21 sorceries, 2 enchantments, 8 artifacts, 1 planeswalker, and 35 lands. Looking at the stats that matter to our game plan, we have 35 instants and sorceries of CMC value 2 or less, 19 spells matters payoffs, 21 cantrips, and 15 draw and discard effects, giving us a whole lot of cheap spells that allow us to cast them back to back, most of which will either be replacing themselves or generating us card advantage even before considering our commander, and enough spells matters payoffs to give us value and hurt our opponents while we sling those spells around at breakneck speed. For general deck stats, we have 17 ramp sources, 3 card draw sources, or 38 instead if we have our commander in play, 10 targeted removal sources, and 2 board wipes. Our base draw being very low, but skyrocketing once our commander hits the field as she effectively turns all our cantrips and draw discard effects into actual card advantage, and our ramp being a bit higher than normal due to the amount of spell-slinging mana generators and rituals we'll be running to keep our spell chains going. Looking at our mana curve, we have 23 1-drops, 27 2-drops, 9 3-drops, 5 4-drops, and 1 5-drop. Leaving us with a hyper-aggressive curve that aims to get our commander out as quickly as possible, ideally with a mana generator or spell payoff in play, and hopefully storm off on the next turn to knock out the entire board before they know what hit them. Currently, this deck is valued at $64.15, not counting the price of basic lands or shipping. This price was calculated by using the cheapest listed marketplace price on TCG Player at the time of this recording. For side grades, there are some alternate cantrips that may be worth considering. Consider, Quicken, and Cerulean Wisps are all generally worth running from the blue side of the pie, as are Rile, Accelerate, and Crimson Wisps if you're more red inclined, all of which are fine additions to support our spell-slinging playstyle. Additionally, the Deck of Many Things may also be worth considering. While its 5 CMC cost may be a bit steep for this build, the recursion, card draw, and alternate win condition it provides may just make it worth running. For upgrades, Prismari Command is a very flexible source of removal, ramp, or card draw depending on what we may need. Visions of Beyond is a passable cantrip on its own, but getting us quite a bit of value if we cast it deep into a spell chain for even more draw. Jeska's Will is a great combination of ritual spell and card advantage source with our commander in play, and Aetherflux Reservoir works nicely as another spell-slinging payoff to gain us life, then later use that life to blow our opponents away. Finally, if you really like the value that Goblin Lore provides, you can add Control to Court as an additional copy of it for even more low mana card advantage at over 100 times the cost. Or you could use that money to buy most of this deck. Your call. Thanks everyone for sticking around until the end of the video. Looking at the results of last week's poll, it looks like Torrent was able to avenge his loss from the previous week by taking the top spot this time, so look forward to a possible human token build featuring him next week. Now looking at this week's poll, seeing as our Crimson Vow builds are getting close to coming to a close, I figured we can give some of the pricier commanders in this set a chance to shine before Kamigawa Neon Dynasty is upon us. That means this week's contenders will be Umbra Sphere Manifest, Olivia Crimson Bride, and Toxrill the Corrosive. Please cast your vote in the community tab, link in the description, and let me know in the comments who you voted for and what commanders from Crimson Vow you'd like to see in a future poll. Before we close out, again, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't done so already, as this channel cannot grow without your support. And if you feel like showing your thanks by keeping me caffeinated while I make these videos, please consider buying me a coffee at the link in the description. Speaking of which, I'd like to thank Tupper Glass for their generous donation. Thanks for the coffee, and thanks for supporting the channel. And if any of you would like to support the channel in a different way, feel free to check out the other deck techs floating around my head if you'd like to see the latest builds, or click on the link above for a playlist of all the cut rate commander episodes I've made so far. And with that, have a good one folks, and stay safe.